You see any of the real Diana in Meghan, did
God,
you?
no.
Really?
No. Sorry.
Are there any fans of Meghan Markle in tonight? Oh, hang on. There is one lone hand has raised up here.
Subversive.
Actually, that is one more.
It was the kind of night where one television moment suddenly made people sit up straighter. Piers Morgan pulled out a stack of photos that looked like they had been hidden away for years, and instantly the whole mood changed. This was not just another talking point or another loud studio debate. This was visual, and that made it harder to brush aside. In that moment, viewers everywhere started asking serious questions about a story they thought they already understood. Everything shifted in a heartbeat, not because someone made another claim, but because something was placed right in front of the audience. Photos can hit differently. Words can be denied, explained, softened, or spun, but images sit there and force people to look. That is the kind of moment that does not just interrupt a broadcast. It cracks the story wide open, because suddenly the version of Meghan Markle the public had been given for years started to feel incomplete. She had often been framed as the struggling actress, the self-made woman, the outsider trying to fight her way through Hollywood like everyone else. And to be fair, every public figure has parts of their life that people do not see. But critics say these photos made the missing pieces feel too important to ignore. Not necessarily proof that every part of her story was false, but enough to make people wonder what had been left out. And that is where the discomfort begins, because what happens when the missing pieces are not tiny details? What happens when they look big enough to change how people understand the whole image? Suddenly, the simple story becomes messy. The humble rise starts looking more complicated. The outsider narrative starts getting questioned. And once the audience starts asking those questions, it is almost impossible to put that doubt back in the box.
Used to charge almost $30,000 per trip, which is why she was making good money. It wasn't on Suits.
What appeared on screen seemed to paint a very different picture from the one many viewers had heard before. For years, Meghan's public image was built around being relatable, hardworking, and determined to make it in Los Angeles. She was presented as someone chasing opportunities, pushing through rejection, and trying to build a career with grit, charm, and persistence. But those photos appeared to suggest something more polished, more connected, and more carefully placed than the story people had been told. Different how? That became the question echoing across living rooms, social media timelines, and comment sections almost immediately. Because these did not feel like random snapshots someone found at the bottom of a drawer. They felt like pieces of a bigger puzzle that had been missing from the table. And that is what made the moment feel so sharp. The photos seemed curated, but not by her. They felt less like warm memories and more like evidence being brought into a public trial of image and reputation. Whether people saw them as harmless old pictures or as something more revealing, the effect was the same. Viewers started comparing the images to the story they had been sold. And when an image appears to contradict a carefully built narrative, people do not just notice. They dig, they zoom in, they compare dates, they revisit old interviews, they ask who was there, why it mattered, and what it says about the version of the story they were first given. That is why this moment landed so hard. It did not simply add drama to the broadcast. It opened a door people were suddenly very eager to walk through.
Early days, she was totally reliant on Soho House to pay for her travel, to pay for her accommodation.
Instead of showing a life built only around everyday struggles, the photos seemed to point towards something very different. Access. They highlighted exclusive events, influential circles, polished rooms, and high-profile gatherings that most regular people never get anywhere near. And that is what made the moment so uncomfortable for viewers. Because the public had often heard one version of the story, the hardworking outsider trying to break into Hollywood, but the images appeared to suggest there may have been another layer sitting quietly behind the scenes. What really got people talking was not just the access itself. Plenty of people in entertainment build connections, attend events, and move through powerful rooms. That is not automatically wrong. The issue, according to critics, was that these connections rarely seemed to appear in the interviews where Meghan discussed her rise to fame. The public heard the struggle, the hustle, the rejection, and the fight to be seen, but they did not always hear much about the exclusive circles that may have helped shape the path. I don't want to be doing another bloody statement on Meghan Markle, Harry. And that is where the tension starts tightening fast, because this is not only about money, status, or who was in the room. It is about timing. When did these connections begin? Who opened the doors? Who made the introductions? And why were those details not made a bigger part of the public story from the beginning? That silence around the questions did not feel accidental to many viewers. It felt strategic, almost like certain chapters had been carefully edited out before the world ever got to read them. Not erased completely, but softened, trimmed, and pushed to the side so the main image could stay clean. Meghan as the determined self-made woman, climbing on her own with no major shortcuts and no hidden help.
Another bloody segment on Meghan Markle and Harry.
And then the rest of it was, and all the racism claims turned out to be bullshit. The mental health claims were all of it was bullshit, designed to damage and attack the royal family, the monarchy, and all.
Once a Soho House basic bitch, always a Soho House basic bitch.
As the images flashed across screens, critics and commentators immediately began debating whether important parts of her past had been left out of the public conversation. This was not just another celebrity headline that people would forget by the next morning. To many viewers, it looked like a carefully built public image was suddenly being pulled apart from every angle, and suddenly it did not feel like gossip anymore. It felt like an investigation. People were not just reacting to one photo or one rumor. They were comparing the pictures to old interviews, comparing the timeline to the image, and asking why the same pieces never seemed to fit neatly together. Because when multiple people start noticing the same inconsistencies, it stops looking like coincidence. It starts looking like a pattern of carefully chosen words, carefully omitted details, carefully controlled access. A story polished so smoothly that the rough edges were almost invisible, but control only works until something slips. And when those photos appeared, critics say the slip was impossible to ignore. One image can reopen a whole timeline. One missing detail can make people question an entire narrative. And once the audience starts digging, every old interview, every polished statement, and every carefully framed story suddenly gets viewed through a different lens.
The life she probably wanted all along.
Yes.
A life of unparalleled luxury and riches that she got by marrying her handsome British prince. She's living back in the state that she came from.
Then came the moment that pushed the whole conversation into overdrive. The images many people had never seen before were suddenly placed in front of a massive audience, and the reaction was instant. This was not some slow leak that trickled into public view piece by piece. It landed all at once, right in the middle of the broadcast, and people immediately started asking what these photos meant for the story they had been told for years. What made the situation so striking was that Piers barely needed to say much. The photos took over the room by themselves. They became the main character of the segment, because once viewers saw them, the debate changed. It was no longer just about old interviews, polished statements, or carefully worded memories. It became visual, and visual evidence, even when it needs context, has a way of staying in people's minds. That is why this story reached far beyond the usual royal headline drama. Words can be denied, statements can be challenged, claims can be softened later with explanations. But images linger. They sit there quietly and make people stare a little longer. They do not argue. They suggest. And what they seemed to suggest in that moment was uncomfortable. A life that may have been orbiting elite circles long before the royal spotlight ever arrived. A network already forming, and a world that may not have been as unfamiliar as the public had been led to believe. That is where the labels started flying. People began using words that have been drilled into us by movies, television, friends, family, and even strangers online. Labels like networking access, influence, and social climbing. And the truth is, nobody wants those labels attached to their story, because once people start seeing ambition through that lens, every old photo starts looking different. The debate quickly shifted toward questions about networking, personal relationships, social climbing.
If you've ever been called crazy or hysterical, or what about nuts, insane, out of your mind, completely irrational?
I don't think that men can control crazy women.
The use of these labels has been drilled into us from movies and TV, from friends and family, and even from random strangers. And the fact is, no one wants this.
And whether certain parts of Meghan's history had been presented differently over the years. Supporters and critics both rushed to examine every detail, but for very different reasons. Supporters wanted context. Critics wanted answers. Everyone was looking for the missing piece that might explain why these images felt so different from the public story that had been repeated for so long. And suddenly, the word networking carried a much heavier meaning. Networking can be normal, it can mean ambition, effort, and knowing how to move through an industry. But networking can also mean access, and access changes everything. It opens doors other people do not even know exist. It creates chances that never appear on a regular resume. It places someone in rooms where opportunity is already breathing before they even ask for it. That raised one dangerous question. Was this really a rise from the outside, or was it a transition between circles? Because those are two very different stories. One is about fighting your way in. The other is about already being closer to the door than people realized. Then came the even messier layer, the old speculation that has followed Meghan for years. Some commentators brought up unverified claims that she may have spent time around yacht circles at one point, while others pointed to alleged old photos and rumors linking her to powerful names, including Prince Andrew when she was reportedly in her early 20s. To be clear, speculation is not proof, and rumors should not be treated as confirmed fact. But the reason people brought them up is because the photos reopen questions about who she knew, where she was, and how early those high-level connections may have started. And once that door opened, the internet did what it always does. It started digging. Old pictures, old timelines, old social circles, old interviews, everything came back under the microscope. Because when a carefully built image starts to wobble, people do not just watch it fall. They look for the first crack.
That's what Meghan has been doing. She's a piece of Klingon, like she clings to somebody who can get her there. So Meghan manages to befriend one person of a very popular group, and then that person introduces her to the others. And because she's being brought in by somebody they trust, she's welcome.
Wasn't there some speculation that she was on Yacht at one point in time? There was photos with her and Prince Andrew way back in the day when she was in her early 20s.
He leaned forward, held up the glossy images, and with a calm, measured approach, delivered the kind of moment that instantly grabs headlines around the world. There was no dramatic speech, no wild hand movements, no over-the-top performance, and no shouting for attention. That was the chilling part. It was controlled. And sometimes that kind of delivery hits harder than any explosive rant ever could, because when someone does not seem desperate to exaggerate, people start assuming the evidence is strong enough to speak on its own. That is exactly what made the room feel different. Piers did not need to scream over the images. He simply showed them, paused, and let the audience sit with what they were seeing. And once those photos were on screen, the world leaned in. Explosive almost feels too small to describe what happened next. The reaction was instant, relentless, and completely out of control. Within minutes, timelines were flooded with theories, comparisons, screenshots, old clips, and side-by-side breakdowns. People were not just watching anymore. They were studying. They were zooming in. They were asking dates, names, locations, and why certain parts of the story had never been made clearer before. And once the internet starts connecting dots, it rarely stops. These were not treated like ordinary snapshots from a casual night out. To many viewers, they looked like pieces of a bigger story that had been sitting in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface.
Newsworthy. So you either then ignore what people are talking about and debating and having all the silly stuff.
They appeared to showcase a lifestyle filled with exclusive access, influential connections, and elite social circles. And that is where the conversation shifted from simple curiosity into serious suspicion, because exclusive circles do not usually open their doors to just anyone. They are built on introductions, trust, status, and gatekeepers who decide who gets inside and who stays outside. That is why these photos cause such a stir. If Meghan's public image had been shaped around struggle, hustle, and the long road toward opportunity, then images showing comfort around powerful people raised uncomfortable questions. Who introduced her to those spaces? How early did those connections begin? And why were those circles not a bigger part of the story when she talked about her rise? Once people started asking about the gatekeepers, the conversation became even sharper. Because gatekeepers lead to names, familiar names, powerful names that do not just appear randomly in someone's life by accident. Critics began wondering whether the story was less about someone fighting from the outside and more about someone already moving near the inside, closer to influence than the public had been led to believe. For many viewers, that image stood in sharp contrast to the version they had heard for years. It did not automatically prove every criticism true, and it did not erase the hard work she may have done, but it did make the public story feel incomplete. And when a story feels incomplete, people start digging for what was left out.
Have Andrew with whom looks like Marcus Anderson. This is in 2001 when Meghan Markle would have allegedly been on third year. Meghan Markle hardly spent any time at Northwestern University. According to people, she got started her yachting days, and she never stopped really. I don't think any of her boyfriends knew about it, but Meghan Markle was known as a hardcore yacht partying person, ready for anything.
That stood in sharp contrast to the modest Hollywood journey many viewers believed they had been hearing about for years. The version often repeated was simple. Meghan was working hard, trying to survive in Los Angeles, pushing through the same kind of rejection and pressure that so many actors face. But the images seemed to suggest a different layer. One with access, introductions, private rooms, and circles most people never get close to. And that contrast was too sharp to ignore, too consistent to dismiss, too revealing to forget. Because if the story was always more complicated than it first appeared, then what else had not been fully shown? What other names, rooms, friendships, and introductions were sitting quietly behind the public version? And more importantly, who knew the fuller picture before everyone else started catching up? Just when people thought the story had already exposed enough, it twisted again, because the deeper commentators looked, the more one name kept surfacing in the background, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Marcus Anderson. Not in giant headlines, not in loud public statements, not in dramatic interviews, but quietly, consistently, and repeatedly across timelines, locations, and key moments that suddenly did not feel so random anymore. Critics say that is what made his name stand out. It was not one appearance, it was the pattern.
All around the world that you would want to know. The very rich, the very connected. Anybody who is anybody would be in Marcus Anderson's little black book. And he's never betrayed a confidence. He's never made a slip.
Because this was not just a friend casually popping up in a few old photos. According to critics, Marcus appeared connected to the very environments those images seem to expose: private clubs, exclusive gatherings, elite rooms, and closed-door spaces where access is not handed out to just anyone. In worlds like that, you do not simply walk in because you are charming. You usually need someone inside to open the door. That is why his role became such a major talking point. Once people noticed how often his presence appeared to line up with important moments in Meghan's life, the question started changing. It was no longer only what happened. It became who helped make it happen. Because proximity is power. And in elite social circles, introductions are not small things. They are currency. Doors do not open just because you knock. They open because somebody on the other side already knows your name. So people began asking how early those introductions may have started, who made them, and how many of those connections quietly shaped a path the public would only understand years later. That is when the speculation stopped feeling scattered and started forming into something more organized. A pattern, one that seemed, at least to critics, to connect Hollywood ambition, global access, elite social circles, and eventually royal destiny into one long thread that had not been fully traced before. And then another name entered the conversation, making everything even more uncomfortable: Prince Andrew. To be clear, this was not presented as a confirmed connection. It was not proof of anything on its own. It was a recurring whisper, the kind of rumor that had floated around online for years, sometimes dismissed, sometimes revived, sometimes buried, and then suddenly dragged back into the spotlight because of those resurfaced images. That is how the internet works. When people think they recognize a face in the background of a photo, they do not just scroll past, they pause. They zoom in. They compare older pictures. They check timelines. They ask whether the setting, the people, and the dates make sense. And when enough people start asking the same question, the conversation changes. It stops sounding like random noise and starts becoming a possibility people want explained. But possibility is not proof, and that distinction matters. Still, Critics argue that the silence around certain questions only made people more curious, because Meghan has been known to challenge media narratives directly in the past, so when this conversation grew louder and there was no strong public pushback, some people found that unusual. Supporters called it restraint. They said not every rumor deserves a response, and that staying quiet can be the smartest move when the internet is running wild. Critics saw it differently. To them, the lack of engagement felt like avoidance, almost like responding would give the story more oxygen or force questions nobody wanted to answer. But everyone seemed to agree on one thing: it felt unusual, not because every claim was proven, but because the situation was messy, visual, and connected to a much bigger debate about image. This was no longer just about who appeared in an old picture. It was about whether the public had been given the full story of Meghan's social rise, her connections, and the circles around her before royalty entered the frame. And while all of this was unfolding, another detail quietly resurfaced, something buried inside Spare. That book was supposed to explain, clarify, and give people a deeper understanding of Harry's side of the story. But ironically, in this moment, critics say it may have done the opposite. Because once old photos, old names, and old timelines started getting pulled back into the light, even details from Spare began to look different. A book meant to close certain questions suddenly became another source people were using to open new ones. And that is when the whole situation became more dangerous for the narrative. The more people looked, the more they felt there were still missing chapters. Because inside its pages were descriptions of familiar places, familiar circles, and familiar environments that suddenly felt more important after those images aired. They were not clear contradictions, and they were not confirmed proof of anything, but they were overlaps. And sometimes overlaps are enough to make people wonder whether two versions of the same story were being told from different angles. And when those angles do not line up cleanly, people start searching for the truth in the space between them. That is when everything turns into a puzzle. Every photo gets studied again. Every old interview gets replayed. Every connection, every timeline, every name in the background gets rearranged, reanalyzed, and reinterpreted. What began as one television moment quickly became something much bigger, a full re-examination of a public narrative that millions thought they already understood. But that is the thing about stories like this. They do not end when the broadcast cuts off. They keep moving. They pull in new details, new theories, and new voices. Because once doubt enters the room, it does not simply leave. It lingers quietly, and it keeps people looking. So the biggest question now is not whether those photos told the full story. It is whether they were only the first glimpse of a bigger story the public has not fully seen yet. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, subscribe, and share for more from Legacy Leaks.